The garage smelled like sun-baked rubber and old victories, a dusty archive of forgotten dreams where time itself seemed to linger in the corners. My uncle had been a collector of lost causes, half-restored motorcycles with engines that whispered promises of speed they could no longer deliver, a jukebox that only played silence, its neon lights flickering like distant memories, and crates of vacuum tubes with paper labels that flaked like fish scales under the weight of decades. He was an enigmatic man, my uncle, a reclusive engineer who spent his life tinkering in the shadows of innovation, always chasing the impossible. Whispers from family gatherings painted him as a genius who had worked on classified projects during the Cold War, experiments with frequencies and fields that bent reality in ways no one fully understood. But he never spoke of it, and after his passing, his garage became a mausoleum of mysteries, waiting for someone foolish enough to disturb it. In the back, behind a collapsing bookshelf of faded popular electronics magazines, their pages yellowed with schematics of radios and early computers, I found it. A waist-high console on casters, wrapped in an army blanket and the kind of secrecy you can feel in your bones, like a hidden artifact from a forbidden era. A brass plaque gleamed faintly, etched with no maker's name, just cryptic symbols that hinted at origins beyond the ordinary. Nixie tubes slept behind a film of dust, their orange glow waiting to awaken. A rotary dial labeled not with numbers but years, spanning from the 1800s to far into the future, as if daring you to spin it like a roulette wheel of fate. It wasn't a prop from some forgotten sci-fi film. No, it thrummed beneath my palm like a trapped sparrow, alive with an energy that pulsed through my veins, whispering of possibilities and perils. There were notes, too, my uncle's tight engineer's handwriting arranged in concentric circles of paranoia, as if the very shape of the words was meant to ward off intruders. Temporal offset must be grounded to prevent drift. Return vector requires a stable anchor, or risk eternal displacement. Never jump blind. Scout the era first through simulations. Each warning was underlined twice, some even thrice, with annotations in red ink detailing failed experiments. One where a test object returned aged by centuries, another where echoes of alternate selves haunted the jumper. I took those underlines as an invitation because that's the sort of arrogance you only recognize in hindsight, the thrill of discovery overriding caution. I should have called someone, a historian, a physicist, even just a friend to talk me out of it. I should have turned around, sealed the garage, and forgotten the whole thing. Instead, I fed the thing a prayer of household current from a nearby outlet, watching as the Nixie tubes woke in a warm orange glow, counting up to a year I didn't choose, the dial spinning on its own as if the machine had a will of its own. The machine had the aesthetic confidence of the 1970s. Bakelite knobs polished to a deep brown shine, a lever with a red rubber cap that felt grippy and urgent under my fingers, braided copper wires snaking like a spine along its side, connecting to capacitors that hummed with stored potential. A voltmeter twitched erratically, its needle dancing like a seismograph sensing an earthquake in time. An old tape loop inside clicked, hissed, and a recorded voice, my uncle's own, gravelly from years of late-night monologues, said, "Engage only when anchor is stable. Verify temporal integrity before transit." The anchor, according to the notes, was any artifact tied to a specific time, something with emotional or historical resonance to act as a tether, preventing you from getting lost in the vast ocean of chronology. My anchor was a dog-eared flyer I kept in my backpack, a reproduction of a 1976 homebrew computer club announcement I'd bought at a flea market for the irony, its creased edges holding the scent of old paper and the promise of a digital revolution. I pressed it to a clamp on the console, the metal jaws closing with a little sigh, as if relieved to have something real to hold onto in this mad endeavor. I told myself I'd run a diagnostic, not a full jump, just a ping, a nudge into the unknown. That's how disasters dress up. They put on lab coats and ask you to be helpful, lulling you with the illusion of control. I thumbed the lever halfway, feeling a subtle vibration build, and suddenly the garage narrowed to a straw of light, the walls compressing as if reality itself was folding. The concrete floor rolled under me like surf on a stormy sea, waves of disorientation crashing over my senses. Smells rearranged themselves. Ozone first, sharp and electric like a thunderstorm indoors, then hot dust from circuits awakening, then the sweet metallic tang of solder melting in workshops long past. Every hair on my arms stood up and saluted, a prickling wave that traveled up my spine. The light went white, blinding and pure, then sepia-toned like an old photograph. Then there was no color at all, just pressure, immense and unrelenting, like a plane taking off inside my bones, compressing my thoughts into a single point of panic. When the world snapped back, it did so with a sound like a film projector chewing through a frame, jagged and mechanical. The machine's casters rattled across a different concrete, smoother, cleaner, with oil stains still young and fresh, not yet ground in by years of neglect. I was still in a garage, but not mine, not the cluttered tomb of my uncle's relics. This one buzzed with life. Posters of rock bands I only knew from history podcasts plastered the walls, their vibrant colors unfaded. Images of Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd staring down with psychedelic intensity. A calendar hung crookedly, featuring a car so long and finned it looked like a joke from a bygone era of excess. Shelves of parts arranged with reverence. Resistors in baby food jars labeled meticulously. A paper bag with a hand-scrawled note. 6,800? Ask Al. Hinting at networks of fellow tinkerers trading secrets in the dead of night. Outside, voices drifted in. Not the algorithm-trained murmur of today's digital echoes, but the quick, bright vowels of people who believe the future can be soldered after dinner. Their words laced with optimism and the raw edge of invention. I froze, my heart pounding like a drum in a silent room. The machine's nixies flickered and settled. 1976. The tape loop clicked again. Anchor acquired. It whispered, smug and mechanical, as if congratulating itself on a job well done. My stomach did a slow roll and then kept rolling, a nausea born of exhilaration and terror. I checked the notes, but they had come with me only as a smear of graphite on my memory, fragments of warnings that now felt incomplete, like puzzle pieces scattered across time. The console's return switch felt suddenly flimsy, like a toy pretending to be a brake, its red cap mocking my growing doubt. I peeked through the crooked garage door, slats of wood warped just enough to offer a glimpse. Sun angled and low and golden, dust particles dancing in cathedral beams of light that painted the scene with an almost divine glow. On the driveway sat a hatchback with a dent like a dimple, its paint faded from California sun, hubcaps spinning lazily in the breeze. Over the fence, a lemon tree drooped fruit the size of softball dreams, their yellow skins bursting with juice that I could almost smell, tart and inviting. The voices were closer now, one high, fast, impatient, like a spark jumping across wires. One lower, laughing in a way that diffused the first, warm and inclusive, drawing you in like a shared secret. I didn't see faces, not yet, only saw the wake of their movement. A coffee mug perched dangerously on a rail, steam rising in lazy curls. A radio playing an ad for something that cost less than $1 and would ruin your life eventually, its tinny speaker crackling with promises of convenience. Every instinct argued with every other. Get back in the machine before you're seen. Don't touch anything, preserve the timeline. Document everything for proof when you return. Leave footprints, make your mark. Be a ghost, invisible and forgotten. My pulse had a metronome's tyranny, tick-tick-tick, syncing with the machine's faint hum. I slid the console farther into the shadows, behind stacks of wooden crates filled with capacitors and coils, threw the army blanket over it, and in the universal language of "this is fine," leaned a broom against the whole contraption as if that would erase it from causality, blending it into the mundane clutter. The machine hummed in protest, a low vibration that resonated in my teeth, and then mercifully quieted, its tubes dimming to embers like a fire dying down after a long night. My brain did the math. 1976 meant the year a hobbyist board would become a company, the year an idea would climb out of a garage and put its mouth to the world's ear, whispering revolutions in code and silicon. I wasn't supposed to be here, not in the broad ethical sense where tampering with time could unravel lives like threads from a tapestry, but in the small, practical one. I didn't have a plan for the next 10 minutes, let alone the next 49 years, no contingency for food, shelter, or blending into a world without smartphones or the internet. And yet the air itself felt different. Less crowded with pollution and noise, more possible, charged with the electricity of untapped potential. My hands itched the way they do when you stand on the edge of a roof and the roof suggests something stupid, a leap into the unknown that promises freedom or folly. I stepped toward the light, the threshold between shadow and revelation. The concrete was cool under my shoes, grounding me in this borrowed reality. Outside, the sky was the blue of a product launch slide, brand new and full of unpromised features, vast and unmarred by satellites or smog. The two voices moved into view as silhouettes first. One wiry, kinetic, moving like a live wire. The other all shoulders and kindness, solid and reassuring. The names arrived in my head the way thunder follows lightning. Steve and Steve. Jobs and Wozniak, the architects of a digital dawn. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as desert sand. The tape loop inside the machine ticked once more, as if clearing its throat from beneath the blanket. Caution, it said softly, its voice muffled but insistent. Contact alters anchor. Too late. I'd already crossed the threshold, stepping into the light where history waited to be touched. They noticed me before I had time to invent a cover story, my presence shattering the intimate bubble of their work. The taller one, sharp-eyed, hair like an argument with gravity, wild and untamed, tilted his head and squinted as though he could see the future written on my forehead, decoding my anachronistic clothes and nervous stance. The other, broad-shouldered with an easy grin that crinkled his eyes, raised a hand in greeting as if I were just another curious neighbor wandering over to borrow a wrench or share a beer. Their energy was different, though palpable, filling the space like an electrical storm on the horizon, alive with anticipation, crackling with the raw power of ideas on the cusp of birth. "Hey!" the wiry one said, his voice brisk, impatient, cutting through the air like a knife. "You lost or something?" That was Jobs. Even without introductions, I knew from the documentaries, the biographies, the legends. His words carried a conviction I'd only ever heard in recordings decades later, a force that demanded attention and brooked no nonsense. I stammered something about being interested in electronics, about hearing the hum of soldering irons from down the street and wanting to see what magic was brewing in this unassuming garage. Wozniak's grin widened, revealing a warmth that seemed to radiate from his core. He seemed to live for company, for sharing the joy of what he loved, his enthusiasm infectious like a virus of creativity. He motioned me closer, waving me over with a grease-streaked hand, and before I could hesitate, I was standing over a crude wooden table where wires sprawled like tangled roots in fertile soil and a primitive motherboard lay half-assembled, its components a patchwork of ingenuity and improvisation. "This," was said proudly, his voice booming with the humble excitement of someone who simply loved the craft, "is going to be a real computer, not some kit where you have to solder it yourself. An actual machine that anyone can use, plug in, and change their world with." His words carried the weight of prophecy, though he spoke them casually, as if describing a weekend project rather than the seed of a technological empire. Jobs watched me carefully, though. He didn't share the same openness. His eyes were calculating, assessing every twitch of my expression. He studied me the way a predator studies an anomaly in the grass, sensing something off but not yet pouncing. Trying to sound casual, blending in with the era's lingo I'd researched from old films, I let slip the wrong thing, a fatal error born of nerves and awe. I muttered how this little board would one day grow into a company worth billions, how their names would be spoken in reverence across generations, etched into the annals of innovation. It was one of those moments where the words tumble out before reason can catch them, propelled by the thrill of standing at ground zero of history. Silence followed, sharp and dangerous, hanging in the air like a guillotine blade. Jobs narrowed his eyes, his posture shifting from casual to alert. "What did you just say?" His tone was low, probing, laced with a mix of intrigue and wariness. Was laughed nervously, assuming I was exaggerating for effect, a fellow dreamer hyping up the potential, but Jobs didn't laugh. His stare pinned me, searching for cracks in the story I hadn't even built yet, his mind already racing ahead to implications I couldn't foresee. I scrambled, pretending I was just making a joke about ambition, about how everyone in this budding tech scene wants to be rich someday. striking it big like the oil barons of old but with circuits instead of crude. But I could see in his eyes that he didn't buy it fully. Curiosity burned there, mixed with suspicion, with a hunger for knowledge that bordered on obsession. This was a man who had no patience for limits, who demanded to know the truth behind every polished answer, every vague response. Still, he let me linger, perhaps sensing an opportunity or just tolerating me for Woz's sake. Maybe because was kept chatting animatedly, showing me their parts scavenged from surplus stores and friends' donations, describing their dream of selling a few dozen machines to hobbyists at the homebrew club, igniting a grassroots revolution. Maybe because some part of Jobs wanted to hear what else I might accidentally reveal, probing for edges of insight that could fuel his own vision. For a few fleeting minutes, I was part of their world. A stranger leaning over history in the making, trying desperately not to shatter it with every word, every breath. But even as I smiled and nodded, absorbing the details of their setup, the scent of flux and heated metal, the scribbled notes on napkins outlining byte allocations, I felt it. The trap was already closing. I had touched the timeline with my clumsy tongue, and the timeline had noticed, ripples spreading outward like stones in a pond, threatening to drown the future I cherished. Was placed a soldering iron in my hand as if I belonged there, his trust as open as the garage door. "Here," he said warmly, his eyes twinkling with shared passion. "Hold this steady while I line up the chip. We're almost there. Imagine what this could do for people putting power in their hands." My palms were slick with sweat, the iron heavy like a burden of fate, but I forced a smile, nodding as if I were one of them. The board in front of me was delicate, a maze of fragile copper veins and early silicon. More artifact than machine in my eyes, a relic that would birth giants. I knew the weight of history balanced on that table, the butterfly effect of every connection. Yet my body betrayed me, nerves frayed from the jump. The iron trembled in my grip, my hand shaking imperceptibly at first, then more. I leaned too far, pressing when I should have waited, and in a blink, the chip cracked with a sound like glass underfoot, a tiny fracture that echoed like thunder in my mind. A thin curl of smoke rose, acrid and accusing, carrying the scent of burned dreams. Wozniak froze, eyes wide with the heartbreak of a craftsman watching hours of labor dissolve in seconds, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of failure had physically pressed down on him. Jobs' face hardened into something sharper, colder, his jaw clenching with restrained fury. "You broke it," he said flatly, not even raising his voice. That was worse than anger. It was judgment, dispassionate and final. The silence stretched, the hum of the fluorescent bulb overhead the only sound, buzzing like an accusation. Was tried to mask the sting with kindness, ever the peacemaker. "It's okay. It's just..." That part wasn't easy to get. Not cheap either. We scraped together every penny for it. But his voice faltered, cracking at the edges, revealing the depth of his disappointment. He knew what I had done, even if he wouldn't say it aloud. Jobs stepped closer, his gaze drilling into me like a laser. "You don't just wander in here, drop cryptic hints about the future, and then ruin what we're building." His suspicion was no longer a flicker. It was a fire catching dry wood, spreading fast. "Who are you? Really?" The question hung heavy, demanding answers I couldn't give without unraveling everything. I wanted to answer, to spill the truth about the machine, the jump, my uncle's warnings. But fear clamped my throat shut, visions of paradox and erasure flashing in my mind. My excuses came out hollow. That I was clumsy, that I was just too eager to help, my modern hands unused to the tactile precision of this era's tools. Yet the damage was undeniable. The board lay silent, inert, potential snuffed out like a candle in the wind. For a moment, it looked as if the dream itself had died with it, the spark of innovation flickering out in a puff of smoke. And then it began. The subtle shiver of wrongness, a vibration in the air that started in my chest and spread outward. Outside the garage, the air felt heavier, as though the sun dimmed by a fraction, casting longer shadows across the driveway. My gut twisted, not from guilt alone but from something deeper, cosmic. a sense that the fabric of reality was tearing at the seams. The machine I had hidden beneath the blanket in the corner flickered in warning, its tubes glowing blood orange through the fabric, a silent alarm. A faint line of text scrolled across its glass. Timeline integrity compromised. Divergence initiated. Was slumped in his chair, rubbing his forehead with calloused hands. Maybe this isn't worth it, he whispered, as if the thought had been waiting in the shadows all along, seeded by past setbacks and now blooming in this moment of defeat. Jobs didn't answer, but his silence was dangerous, pregnant with unspoken doubts. The spark in his eyes, the one history remembered as unquenchable, flickered with uncertainty, a vulnerability I'd never imagined from the icon he would become. I realized with horror, this wasn't just a mistake. I hadn't just broken a chip. I had broken the moment that was supposed to ignite an empire, the fragile pivot where perseverance turned hobby into history. And the world outside had already begun to change in response, the ripples expanding into waves that could drown entire eras. It began with small distortions, insidious at first, creeping in like fog. At first I thought it was just adrenaline messing with me, my senses overwhelmed by the jump and the mishap. But no, the shifts were real, tangible alterations in the tapestry of time. The posters on the garage wall, the ones I had noticed earlier with their vibrant rock band imagery, had changed subtly. Where before I'd seen Led Zeppelin in full psychedelic glory, now there were faded ads for electronics kits from companies I didn't recognize, brands like Electrodyne and Circuit Masters that felt generic, soulless. Even the radio in the corner, still humming softly with static-laced tunes, was different. The announcer mentioned a tech brand I had never heard of, Macrosoft Systems, one that seemed to dominate the airwaves with a confidence that felt wrong, monopolistic, as if it had already claimed the future's throne. I stumbled back to the machine under the blanket, my legs unsteady, pulling aside the fabric with trembling hands. The Nixie tubes blinked furiously, cycling through warnings like a heartbeat gone wild. Anomaly detected. History damaged. Correction required. My uncle's notes had been clear enough about one thing. A small disruption could ripple outward like cracks on ice, fracturing events downstream. Stock markets shifting, inventions delayed, entire cultural movements stifled. I was standing at the epicenter of those cracks, the unwitting architect of chaos. When I stepped outside, the changes became undeniable, assaulting my senses like a barrage. The car in the driveway wasn't the same model anymore. The hatchback I'd seen earlier was now a bulkier, unfamiliar brand, its chrome badge declaring Ameritech Motors, a company I didn't remember from any timeline, its design clunky and uninspired. Down the street, a kid pedaled by on a bicycle with a logo I couldn't place, Unicycle Incorporated, and the houses seemed slightly altered, their colors muted, lawns less vibrant. The air itself felt off, thicker with an industrial haze that hadn't been there before, as though the entire world had inhaled but refused to exhale, holding its breath in anticipation of further unraveling. Inside the garage was buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders heaving. "Maybe this is a sign," he muttered, his voice laced with resignation. "Maybe nobody wants this. Maybe we should stop before we waste more money on something that'll never fly." His words cut deeper than the broken chip, echoing the doubts that must have plagued them in quieter moments. The financial strains, the late nights, the ridicule from skeptics who saw computers as toys for nerds. Jobs paced, restless, chewing on the inside of his cheek, his mind a whirlwind I could almost hear. He glanced at me, suspicion burning in his eyes, but he didn't argue with Woz. And that silence terrified me more than anything, a void where determination should have been. I could feel the future unraveling, threads pulling loose in my mind's eye. I thought of the glowing Apple logo I had grown up with illuminating screens in classrooms and cafes, of the devices that had shaped my world. iPhones in every pocket, Macs powering artists and engineers, gone, replaced by bland alternatives. The empty spaces in my memory filled with a shadowed reality where progress slowed to a crawl, where creativity bent beneath the weight of mediocrity, dominated by faceless corporations that prioritized control over innovation. The machine in the corner groaned like it was alive, like it too was panicking, its frame vibrating with urgency. I tried to steady my breathing, drawing in the garage's mix of solder and optimism. This wasn't over. The notes had said damage could be repaired, but only if I acted quickly, before the divergence solidified like concrete. That chip I had destroyed wasn't just metal and silicon. It was a keystone in the arch of history, the critical component that enabled the Apple-ized logic to function. If I could replace it, maybe the cracks could heal, the timeline snapping back like a rubber band. But rare components in 1976 weren't exactly waiting on store shelves. They were hunted treasures in a nascent ecosystem of surplus dealers and underground traders. A plan began to form, reckless and impossible, fueled by desperation. I would have to track down the part in the real world of the 70s, hunt it through back alleys of San Jose, barter with hobbyists in dimly lit basements, beg from collectors who guarded their stockpiles like dragons hoarding gold. My machine whispered with one final warning before falling silent. Fail, and anchor dissolves. All paths lead to oblivion. The stakes were clear. Not just my return, but the preservation of a world where innovation flourished freely. I looked back at Jobs and Woz. Two young men balanced on the knife edge of giving up, their faces etched with the raw vulnerability of creators on the brink, and felt the weight of centuries on my shoulders. If I didn't act, the future I knew would vanish into something unrecognizable, a dystopia of stagnation. History was bleeding out, and I was the only one with a tourniquet, the reluctant hero in a story I never asked to star in. San Jose in the 1970s wasn't the polished tech capital I knew from my time. It was raw, restless, still wearing the skin of farmland and suburbs, a patchwork of orchards giving way to asphalt. Strip malls leaned against vacant lots dotted with wildflowers. Neon signs buzzed weakly above diners that smelled of grease and cigarette smoke, their booths filled with truckers and dreamers nursing coffee into the night. The streets throbbed with a mix of youth rebellion, long-haired kids blasting rock from 8-track players, and quiet desperation, families scraping by in the shadow of inflation. I carried only a vague description of the part one needed, a rare MOS technology 6502 microprocessor, the brain that would one day pulse inside the first Apple, efficient and affordable, the underdog chip that outshone its pricier rivals. I asked around carefully, trying not to sound like a lunatic from another era, mimicking the slang I'd heard in old movies. Far out, groovy, anything to blend in. Most people laughed, waved me off with a puff of smoke, or tried to sell me junk. Rusted transistors or outdated vacuum tubes. One man in a cluttered record store, shelves groaning under vinyls of Dylan and Hendrix, pointed me toward a group of tinkerers who traded parts the way gamblers traded cards, meeting in hidden spots to swap secrets and schematics. I found them in a smoky back room of a hobby shop, tables littered with circuit boards, overflowing ashtrays and dreams half-soldered into life. The air thick with the haze of Marlboros and heated debates about microprocessors versus mini-computers. They were suspicious of me instantly. My clothes, slightly too modern and cut despite my efforts. My accent, tinged with future inflections. Even my curiosity, too pointed for a casual browser. When I mentioned the 6502, the air thickened, eyes narrowing as if I'd asked for contraband. That chip's not easy to find. One of them muttered, stroking his bushy beard streaked with gray, his fingers stained from flux. And if you do find it, it's gonna cost more than a month's rent. Another laughed, a raspy chuckle. What do you even need it for? You building a rocket to the moon or something? They didn't understand the truth, and I couldn't tell them, couldn't reveal the cosmic stakes without sounding insane. To them, I was just another desperate hobbyist, chasing parts like a scavenger in a junkyard of possibilities. My search led me deeper, into garages where hippies soldered beside stacks of vinyl records, debating philosophy while wiring logic gates, into smoky apartments where engineers argued about binary versus hexadecimal over cans of Pabst Blue Ribbon, passing joints that filled the air with earthy sweetness, into basements where kids no older than I had been when I first touched a computer dreamed of changing the world, their eyes alight with the same fire I'd seen in Woz. Each encounter chipped at me. Their hope, unjaded and fierce. Their raw ambition, untainted by corporate greed. It was a reminder of what could be lost if I failed. a vibrant ecosystem of garage innovators, the birthplace of the personal computing revolution, potentially smothered before it could breathe. Along the way, I dodged close calls. A suspicious cop eyeing my lack of ID, forcing me to slip into alleys. A shady dealer trying to palm off a counterfeit chip, which I spotted only because of my future knowledge of markings. I bartered with what little I had, trinkets from my pocket that seemed futuristic here, like a digital watch that drew gasps, and gathered scraps of info, piecing together leads like a detective in a noir film. Finally, in a dusty pawnshop on the outskirts, lit by a single flickering bulb that cast long shadows across shelves of forgotten treasures, old radios, pawned guitars, boxes of tangled wires, I found it. The shop was a time capsule itself, smelling of mothballs and regret. The owner a grizzled veteran with a scar across his cheek, muttering about Vietnam under his breath. A box of outdated electronics sat on a shelf no one bothered to look at. And there, almost hidden beneath tangles of wire and discarded diodes, was the chip. Its markings were faint, the pins slightly bent from mishandling, but it was real, authentic, the holy grail in miniature form. The shopkeeper eyed me with indifference until I placed money. 1970s bills I had scavenged from my uncle's old box of mementos, crisp 20s that felt archaic in my hand, on the counter. Then he shrugged, slid it toward me without a word, and returned to his newspaper, headlines blaring about Watergate's lingering scandals. I held it like a relic, terrified it might vanish if I blinked, my fingers tracing its edges as if to confirm its solidity. This tiny piece of silicon was more than a part. It was a fuse for the explosion of innovation, the spark for a revolution that would democratize technology, putting computing power into the hands of artists, educators, rebels. Yet as I left the shop, stepping into the cooling evening air where streetlights buzzed to life, a chill followed me. The machine in the garage wasn't silent anymore. I could feel its pull, a faint vibration in the air resonating with the chip in my pocket, as if warning me that the timeline was still unstable, teetering on the edge of further divergence. Clutching the chip, I realized my journey wasn't over. The hardest part lay ahead, convincing Jobs and Wozniak to try again, to reignite their faltering dream. And with Jobs already doubting me, already sharpening his suspicions into weapons, I knew my return to that garage would be a battlefield of trust, where one misstep could shatter everything anew. One wrong word, and the future would crumble in my hands, dust slipping through fingers that had already grasped too much. When I returned to the garage, the atmosphere was heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the doubt, thickening the air with unspoken regrets. Wozniak was hunched over a schematic spread across the table, lines of fatigue carved into his face like etchings on a circuit board. His usual warmth dimmed. Jobs stood apart, arms folded tightly across his chest, eyes fixed on me with a sharpness that felt like interrogation before he'd even spoken, his mind already dissecting my every move. "You've been gone a while," Jobs said, voice low and deliberate, each word measured like a chess move. "Funny how you show up out of nowhere, break our prototype, disappear into God knows where, and then come back carrying exactly the part we needed." His gaze slid to the small box in my hand, then back to me, piercing. "So tell me, what's your game? Who sent you? Some competitor sniffing around?" My chest tightened, a vice of anxiety squeezing my ribs. I tried to laugh it off, to play the role of an overenthusiastic hobbyist who just got lucky scouring the local scene, describing vague connections in the Tinkerer underground. Was, ever the optimist, wanted to believe, his eyes lighting up at the sight of the chip. "Maybe he really is just trying to help. Steve," he said gently, looking at the component with something close to awe, his fingers itching to integrate it. But Jobs wasn't swayed. His skepticism was a wall, unyielding. "No," he snapped, his voice rising with controlled intensity. "Nobody just finds this kind of thing. Not here. Not now, when parts like this are rarer than hen's teeth." He took a step closer, eyes burning with that legendary intensity. "You know things you shouldn't. You've hinted at futures you shouldn't even imagine, companies worth billions, our names in lights. I want the truth. Who are you? A spy? A visionary? Or something worse?" For a moment I almost told him everything, that I came from decades ahead, where their creation had sparked a global transformation, that my mistake had nearly unraveled it all, and this chip was my atonement. But I saw the danger in his face, the way his ambition could twist revelation into threat. Jobs wasn't someone who tolerated half-truths. He demanded full control. If I revealed too much, he might see me not as a friend, but as a thief of destiny, someone meddling with what should be his alone to shape, potentially altering his path in unpredictable ways. I just believe in what you're building, I managed, my voice trembling despite my efforts to steady it. More than I can explain. I've seen glimpses of what tech can do, and this is the start of something huge. It was the truth, though stripped of its impossible edges, laced with the passion of someone who knew the outcome. Jobs studied me for a long moment, the garage quiet except for the faint buzz of the fluorescent light and the distant hum of traffic. Broke the silence first, reaching out to take the chip with careful hands. Whatever his reasons, we need this, he said softly, his voice a bridge between doubt and hope. If we give up now, we'll never know what could have been. We've come too far to let one setback end it. Jobs didn't answer right away. He paced, restless, the weight of choice in every stride, his mind visibly churning through scenarios. Risks, rewards, the allure of the unknown. At last, he stopped, his voice like a blade tempered in fire. Fine, but I'm watching you. One wrong move and you're out. Permanently. And if this works, you owe us answers. The tension lingered, wrapping around us like barbed wire, prickling with unspoken threats. I placed the chip gently on the workbench, my heart pounding with the knowledge that both their dream and my secret balanced on the thinnest of threads. And in Jobs' eyes, I saw something that terrified me even more than his suspicion. Hunger. The kind of hunger that wouldn't stop until he had all the answers, devouring obstacles in pursuit of greatness. As began the repair, I wondered if my presence had already planted seeds of change, subtle shifts that could bloom into unforeseen branches of history. The chip sat on the workbench like a loaded gun, primed and waiting for its moment. Wozniak handled it with reverence, bending the pins back into place with pliers that clicked softly, his fingers moving with quiet devotion honed from countless hours of trial and error. Jobs hovered nearby, still suspicious but silent, for once letting was take the lead, though his eyes darted between us like a hawk scanning for prey. I tried to steady my breathing, focusing on the sense of fresh solder and warmed wood, but the machine under the army blanket in the corner was no longer quiet. Its Nixie tubes pulsed irregularly, glowing and dimming like a fevered heartbeat, a harbinger I couldn't ignore. When pressed the chip into the board, seating it with a satisfying click, something shifted in me. Relief, maybe, or the illusion of it, a momentary calm in the storm. But before I could exhale fully, the machine spoke. A mechanical click echoed from the shadows. Then the voice on the tape loop rasped, "Anchor unstable. Return window closing." My stomach dropped like a stone into an abyss, cold dread flooding my veins. I pulled back the blanket with haste, revealing the console in all its erratic glory. It flickered with warnings I hadn't seen before, new alerts born of the deepening divergence. Lines of orange text scrolled across its cracked glass display. Jump vector failing. Reverse transit at risk. Temporal storm approaching. Translation. If I didn't leave soon, the machine would never bring me home. The pathways through time were collapsing under the strain of my meddling. I'd be stuck here, just another ghost lost in borrowed time, adrift in an era without my familiar anchors. For a long moment, I stared at the lever, my escape route glowing faintly like a beacon in the dim garage light, tempting me with the promise of return. My body screamed at me to pull it, to flee back to safety, to the world I knew with its conveniences and certainties. But then I looked at Wozniak, hunched over the board with furrowed brow, soldering connections with the concentration of a monk painting scripture, his dedication a quiet force. I looked at Jobs, pacing like a caged animal, ambition boiling just beneath his skin, ready to erupt. And I thought of everything this fragile moment carried. Not just a computer, but an entire future, of smartphones connecting billions, of creative tools empowering the masses, of a cultural shift toward individuality and innovation. My pulse hammered in my ears, a frantic rhythm syncing with the machine's warnings. If I left now, history might remain broken, the doubt I'd sown lingering like a poison, potentially derailing Apple before it could soar. The devices that had shaped my world, my life, could vanish into the void, replaced by a monochrome alternative. Could I really return to safety knowing I had stolen that future from billions, condemning them to a lesser path? The machine clicked again, its voice cutting through my turmoil. 10 minutes until closure. Initiate return or face permanent exile. Its tone was calm, merciless, a programmed indifference to human drama. Woz didn't even hear it. He was too absorbed in coaxing the board back to life, murmuring encouragements to the circuits as if they were alive. Jobs, though, noticed my expression, the sweat beading on my forehead. His eyes narrowed further, sensing I was fighting some unseen battle, and it unnerved him, adding another layer to his scrutiny. I clenched my fists, torn in half by the ultimatum. On one side, the chance to return home to my time, to the certainty of my own life, family, friends, a world where Apple reigned. On the other, the chance to repair what I had broken fully, ensuring the spark ignited, at the cost of being stranded forever in a world not yet ready for me, navigating the 1970s with no safety net, forging a new existence from scratch. And then the solder cooled, the board gleamed under the light, its connections pristine once more, and was looked up with a spark of hope in his eyes. "It's ready to test," he said, his voice trembling with both fear and excitement, a mix that captured the essence of true invention, the leap into uncertainty. I took a step toward the machine in the corner, my hand hovering over the lever. Then I stopped, frozen by the gravity of the choice. My decision pressed down on me with the weight of decades yet to be written, eras hinging on this single pivot. I knew then, survival had a price and so did sacrifice. One of them would demand my future, the other, everyone else's. As the countdown ticked in my mind, I weighed not just my fate, but the legacy of two men whose vision could illuminate or fade, depending on what I chose next. The hum of the garage deepened as was pressed the power switch, his finger lingering for a split second as if in prayer. For a heartbeat, nothing happened, just the silence of three people holding their breath, the air thick with anticipation and the faint scent of ozone from the warming components. Then the board lit up, faintly at first, LEDs blinking like the hesitant eyes of a newborn awakening to the world, their green and red glows casting ethereal patterns on the walls. Woz's face broke into a grin so wide it seemed to light the room brighter than the bulbs overhead, his laughter bubbling up like a release of pent-up energy. "It works. Look at that. It's alive." Jobs leaned closer, his suspicion melting into something fiercer. Possibility, raw and unbridled, his eyes widening as he traced the flickering lights, already envisioning markets and masses. I should have felt relief, a wave of triumph washing over me. Instead, I felt the finality of a choice sealing itself shut, irrevocable. Behind me, the machine under the blanket shrieked with static, a burst of noise that made Jobs and Woz glance over curiously. Its tape loop stuttered, return vector expired, temporal anchor dissolving. The Nixie tubes dimmed to embers, flickering out one by one. I understood in that instant. My way back was gone. I had traded my life for this moment, lingering too long to ensure the repair took hold, the timeline mending around this reborn prototype. And yet, watching them, I knew I'd chosen right, a bittersweet certainty settling in my chest. Wozniak's joy was pure, untainted by ambition, the joy of creation for its own sake. His hands clapping together in delight as he pointed out the stable signals. Jobs' eyes burned, not with suspicion now but with vision, with the conviction that this fragile piece of silicon and wire could ignite something unstoppable, a fire that would spread across industries and continents. Together, they leaned over the table, already discussing improvements. Faster processors, user-friendly interfaces, expansions, dreams that spilled out faster than they could catch them. their voices overlapping in a symphony of excitement. I felt invisible, but not in a lonely way. More like a witness, an anchor to history itself, a silent guardian who had ensured the continuity. The first Apple computer was alive, and with it the promise of everything I had known in my world. The devices, the revolutions, the ways in which billions of lives would be rewritten by accessible technology. All because this night, in this unremarkable garage tucked away in Los Altos, two young men refused to let failure win, bolstered by a stranger's intervention. Jobs looked at me briefly, a flicker of acknowledgement in his sharp eyes, perhaps a grudging respect or lingering curiosity. Maybe he still suspected something otherworldly about me. Maybe he still wanted answers I could never give without risking further disruption. But he said nothing, his focus shifting back to the board. Instead, he turned to Woz, already pushing him harder, faster, toward the future with questions like, what if we make it smaller? What if we sell it to the world? That hunger in him would never die, it would fuel empires. I pressed my hand lightly against the machine under the blanket, its hum now fading like a dying heartbeat, the metal cooling under my touch. My chest ached with the knowledge that I would never see home again. Not the version I had left, with its familiar skyline and digital hum. But as I listened to the laughter of two visionaries, as I watched the fragile spark grow brighter, illuminating their faces with possibility, I felt something steadier than regret. A sense of purpose, of having been the unseen catalyst. I wasn't just stuck here. I was part of it now, the birth of a legend, woven into its origins like a hidden thread. And if I had to vanish into the margins of history to protect it, then so be it. The world needed them more than it ever needed me, their innovation a beacon that would guide humanity forward. In the quiet aftermath, as they celebrated with claps on the back and plans for the Homebrew Club demo, I slipped into the background, content to be the forgotten footnote in a story that would echo through time. The celebration in the garage was still echoing in my chest, a warm afterglow of triumph amid the clatter of tools and excited chatter. When it happened, a twist I never anticipated. 1 second I was leaning against the shrouded time machine, trying to savor the moment, to etch it into my memory as compensation for my sacrifice, and the next it roared awake with a violence I hadn't commanded. The Nixie tubes flared blinding white, illuminating the garage like a flash of lightning. The blanket slipped off as if pulled by unseen hands, and the whole console screamed with static, a cacophony of distorted warnings and mechanical groans. Jobs and was spun around, startled, their faces a mix of confusion and alarm. Jobs reaching for a nearby tool as if ready to defend, Woz's eyes wide with technical curiosity. But before I could warn them, shout for them to stay back, the machine's lever slammed down on its own, an autonomous lurch that defied my control. Light swallowed me whole, a vortex of blinding energy that pulled at my very atoms. The world around me stretched and tore, the laughter of the two Steves dissolving into a howl of distortion, echoing faintly as reality fractured. I clawed at the air, begging the machine to stop, my voice lost in the maelstrom, but it didn't listen. This wasn't a return, it was a rupture, a violent ejection born of the timeline's self-correction, perhaps rejecting my prolonged presence like a body expelling a foreign object. I fell through the crack in time like a stone dropped into a bottomless well, tumbling through voids of color and sound, glimpses of alternate histories flashing by, worlds where wars raged unchecked, eras of technological stagnation, moments of triumph twisted into tragedy. When I landed, the silence was wrong. Oppressive, sterile, lacking the organic buzz of life. The garage was gone, replaced by a gleaming plaza of steel and glass towers that pierced the sky like indifferent sentinels, each one stamped with a logo I had never seen. A single angular that glared down from billboards, holographic screens, even the sides of autonomous buses gliding silently by. Crowds moved around me, heads bowed to sleek handheld devices. Not iPhones with their elegant curves, but something alien, sharper, more sterile, interfaces locked down with uniformity. I staggered forward, disoriented, searching for any sign of Apple, any glimmer of the bitten fruit that symbolized creativity and rebellion. There was none, erased as if it had never been. Every storefront, every gadget kiosk, every advertisement bore the same name: Microsoft Systems, a monolithic entity that dominated with cold efficiency. The air itself felt uniform, filtered and climate-controlled, suffocating in its perfection, devoid of the chaotic vibrancy I remembered. In a nearby cafe, its patrons sipping synthetic coffees from identical mugs, a wall-sized screen replayed history, but not the history I knew, a distorted narrative that twisted my gut. There was no garage in Los Altos, no smiling Wozniak beside a crude motherboard, no fire in Jobs' eyes igniting the personal computing era. Instead, the documentary praised Microsoft's pioneering vision of personal computing, led by executives in gray suits, their smiles tight and hollow, recounting mergers and acquisitions that crushed competitors before they could bloom. The narrator's voice was flat, reverent, describing a world where innovation had been standardized, domesticated, computers as tools for productivity, not empowerment. Software locked behind paywalls, creativity curtailed by corporate oversight. My stomach twisted into knots. I had saved Apple once, but somehow, in the act of lingering, of ensuring the repair, my interference had tilted history just enough for another titan to rise, stamping out the chaos and creativity that should have defined the age. Perhaps my words to Jobs had planted seeds of paranoia, or my presence had delayed a key meeting. Subtle butterflies flapping wings into hurricanes. This wasn't home. This was a parallel reality, a sideways slide where Microsoft had filled the vacuum, monopolizing the digital landscape into a gray uniformity. The machine hissed behind me, still sparking erratically, its console half melted from the strain, its tubes flickering like dying stars in a void. I realized it had flung me sideways instead of back, a malfunction born of overload. And now, even broken, it hummed with a cruel truth. There might be no path home at all, the anchors severed, the vectors collapsed into infinity. I stood in the plaza, surrounded by a future I didn't recognize. A world of efficient drones, where individuality was a relic, holding in my chest the memory of a world that might never return. A world I had glimpsed only briefly, then lost to the pull of time itself, a casualty of my own hubris and heroism. I don't know how long I wandered that city of glass and silence, my footsteps echoing hollowly on polished marble. But eventually I stopped running, exhaustion forcing me to confront the irreversible. You can only chase a vanished world for so long before you realize it isn't coming back, that the chase itself is a form of denial. The Microsoft billboards glared down from every corner, their neon reflections stretching across windows like bars of a cage, advertising unified computing solutions that promised connectivity but delivered isolation. People walked past me, faces blank and illuminated by device screens. No sparks of wonder in their eyes, no glimmers of rebellion, just obedience to a single empire. Their lives scripted by algorithms designed for compliance rather than creation. The machine had collapsed in on itself during the transit, smoking and silent now, its guts spilling across the plaza like the remains of a wounded animal. Twisted wires, shattered tubes, the rotary dial frozen midway between years. I touched its cold metal frame, feeling the last vestiges of its energy fade, and knew it would never work again, its core fried by the violent shift. The return vector was gone, along with any hope of mending the divergence. My home, my timeline, the one where Apple had risen from a garage to set fire to the imagination of billions, fostering a culture of thinkers and makers, was lost to me, a phantom memory in this sterile expanse. And yet, inside my skull, the memory burned bright, undimmed by the surrounding grayness. I had seen Wozniak's joy as the Apple I came alive, his laughter a pure expression of triumph over adversity. I had felt the intensity of Jobs' gaze as he leaned toward the future, his mind a forge of ideas that would reshape society. I had watched the legend begin, even if this world would never know it, its history rewritten to glorify Microsoft's calculated ascent. Perhaps through aggressive patents, buyouts of fledgling competitors like the nascent Apple, or simply by capitalizing on the doubt I had inadvertently sown. That truth lived in me and me alone, a secret archive of what could have been, what should have been. When I finally spoke, It wasn't to the city around me, its inhabitants too engrossed in their devices to notice a disheveled stranger. It was to you, to anyone who would listen across the voids of possibility. Because if history had erased Apple, if this world had forgotten the garage-born revolution, then someone had to remember to preserve the flame in oral tradition if nothing else. Do you understand what that means? It means the world you know, the glowing logos on laptops that empower creators, the devices in your pockets that connect dreamers worldwide, the revolution born in a garage amid doubt and determination, exists only because I chose to stay behind, to ensure the spark ignited despite the cost. In this place, in this timeline, I am a ghost of a story that never happened, wandering anonymous streets, perhaps finding work as a forgotten tinkerer in Microsoft's shadow, piecing together relics of a freer era. But in yours, I was the shadow behind the spark, the unseen hand that mended the break. So this is the truth, the one I cannot prove but cannot deny. I both ended and preserved an empire. I was the hand that broke it, cracking the chip in a moment of clumsiness that nearly extinguished the dream. The voice that sowed doubt with careless words from the future. And how, in the end, I saved it, scouring the underbelly of 1970s Silicon Valley for redemption, convincing two visionaries to press on, though the price was my own future. Stranded first in their time, then hurled into this parallel abyss. History belongs to the victors, the ones who write the code and shape the narrative. But sometimes, just sometimes, it belongs to the ones who gave everything to keep it alive, even if no one remembers their name, even if their sacrifice echoes only in alternate whispers. I am that echo now, a narrator from the fringes, urging you to cherish the chaos of innovation, lest it slip away into uniformity. Remember the garage, the broken chip, the mended dream, for in every timeline, such moments define us all.